I love this psalm in particular only because one is one of my favorite, but have you ever had someone attach a phrase or an image to a phrase and you can never hear that phrase again without that image? Well, I was in the kitchen, one of my favorite places, and I had made a fabulous dinner for my family, and I was taking out their most requested item, which is my mac and cheese. And as I was taking this hot, bubbling casserole dish of mac and cheese out of the oven, I said, without thinking about it, as Miles was nonchalantly walking past, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." And Miles, without hesitating, walks past and says, "Leave it to my mother to turn anything into a sermon." And so every time I hear, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good," that image comes to mind. And it did again this week as I was preparing to stand before you. Lord, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, my Lord, my Savior, and my Redeemer. As always, I am both humbled and delighted to be before this wonderful congregation. And I am especially grateful for those of us who are visiting with us today, both in the sanctuary and on Zoom. I see a couple of familiar names and maybe even a recognizable phone number. And so welcome those who are part of this family, who are worshiping with us in Zoom, and those who we welcome as family, as visitors. Indeed, as has been mentioned, you are welcome here. I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge that this morning's sermon may land a bit differently than previous messages that I've preached here. Like Elijah, I acknowledge this morning I'm preaching from a place of exhaustion. And to be completely transparent, I'm experiencing what is commonly referred to as Black fatigue. See, Black fatigue is the result of living in a perpetual state of survival and often re-traumatization, and the all too frequent necessary attempts to declare one's own and others' rights to simply survive, coupled with the never-ending fight for opportunities to thrive. You see, Black fatigue has been a common part of our conversations this past week, for myself and many of my colleagues from Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, along with numerous other colleagues and members of the community, as we relive the traumatization of events surrounding the death of Michael Brown. I was a student pastor at an AME congregation in St. Charles, Missouri, about 8 miles from Ferguson. My friends like Sonia Van, who has preached for us here and participated in conversations after worship, and who has been in the morning prayer call, she herself was present on the ground in Ferguson. My phone was flooded with Google pictures this week recapping the 1-year anniversary events when I was a graduate teaching assistant at Eden, and I was asked to lead a group of students from Pacific School of Religion in a graduate course preaching in the public square. I served as a guide to students as we revisited the streets of Ferguson. I witnessed women and men having visceral reactions as their bodies recalled the stench of tear gas and the sting of rubber bullets. Now here we are, the 10th anniversary. The 10th anniversary memorial of Michael Brown included a number of community events in and around Ferguson and St. Louis, Missouri. One event in particular was a community viewing of the documentary 13 Days in Ferguson. I stayed in close contact with one in particular, my dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould, who acknowledged that re-entering this space and the visual images of the horror that she and others actually lived through was traumatizing. Clergy showing up in peace to march in support of the Brown family and the Ferguson community, who found ourselves having to learn how to successfully engage in war tactics. Women and men of God, for whom Palestinian students showed up and taught us on the ground how to protect our bodies from militarized assaults with tear gas. Having never been in the military. Every day, men and women, young people, college students, preachers, teachers were learning tactical warfare simply because we wanted to be a presence of peace. Palestinian students for whom we now make pilgrimages or attempt at least to Palestine to bring a sense of peace to them and their families. And the week continued. This week, I spoke extensively over the telephone with my former pastor, the Reverend Lukata Mjumbe, who is now the executive director of the Alabama African American Civil Rights Consortium. He and a group of colleagues who were simply attempting to make this peaceful presence in Palestine had their efforts delayed, uncertain as to if and when they will be able to make a presence of peace. But that wasn't all. The week continued. I received a call from the daughter of a 71-year-old African-American man, and the daughter was wrestling with the question, can I trust what the medical providers are telling me about my father? Her father is 71 years old, has a history of circulation issues and a history of a toe amputation, which the circulation issues continued, and he has now a bilateral lower extremity amputee. And the recommendation for this 71-year-old man was to go home on hospice. My first thought was, based on what? If the legs have been amputated, and in as much as he is in physical therapy, and in as much as he is doing well and progressing and advancing in physical therapy, in as much as he's being fit for prosthetics, why would someone recommend hospice? Surely, daughter, there must be another diagnosis. She said, they told me Parkinson-like symptoms. I waited because surely there must be something else. I said, no. I reached out to my brother who's there at the hospital now. I said, what exactly is Parkinson-like symptoms? After some conversation, she concluded, as I answered questions about what hospice is and is not, what Medicare will and will not pay for, she concluded that indeed hospice was not appropriate for their family at this time. What's my point? As always, I'm glad you asked. You see, we all, absolutely, without a doubt, it is necessary that we are all prepared to question and to insist that practitioners educate us sufficiently before we make critical medical decisions. That's true for all of us. But when you add the element of race, This poor daughter is not only wondering if she's being given the best possible medical options for her father, she's wrestling with the very real possibility that she's not being offered the very best simply because he's a Black man. The dark, questionable historical relationship between Western medicine and people of color is still very much alive and well. Does the smallpox mean anything to anybody? Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases brought by Europeans to the Western Hemisphere, and it had devastating effects on our Native American population. It's estimated that smallpox killed more Native Americans in the early centuries than any other disease or conflict. Does Tuskegee Airmen ring a bell? 1941, Air Corps began military experiment to see if the phrase of the time, Negroes could be trained as combat pilots and support personnel. The experiment served to test findings and study that asserted that the Negro was fundamentally inferior. But how about Henrietta Lacks? 1951. A young mother of 5 who showed up at Johns Hopkins Medical Center complaining of vaginal bleeding, and it was discovered that she had cervical cancer, and she died at 36 years old. But what no one told the family until 1973 was that her cells had been harvested and were being used in research across the world. These incredible cells, nicknamed the HeLa cells for the first 2 letters of her first and last name, are used to study the effects of toxins and drugs and hormones and viruses on the growth of cancer cells. Why? Because they discovered that other cells that were dying while Henrietta Lacks's cells were mutating and growing. Her healthy cells. Her family did not become aware of this atrocity until 1973, 22 years after her death, when scientists reached out to her children looking for blood samples, and the family learned why. Their mother's cells were being used in experiments in cancer labs all over the globe. Black fatigue is real. And like Elijah, Dr. Cassandra Gould, and my very dear friend who we've mentioned earlier, Minister Sonia Van, and like Reverend Lukata M. Jumbe, and like the unnamed but also concerned daughter for her father, and even myself, these foot soldiers who have been assigned with the task of standing up for and standing with the marginalized, the oppressed, the abandoned, the forsaken, the ostracized, and the omitted, many of us acknowledge that at some point we felt like Elijah. Well, those of you here know me well enough by now to know that I like to provide 2 critical pieces whenever I'm graced with the opportunity to speak to God's people. First, I think it's important that I always disclose something personal about myself that allows those of you who are here worshiping with me and those of you who are here worshiping with us virtual to get to know me better than beyond just the preacher, but to get to know me as a person. I hope I've sufficiently done that. And the second, I find it necessary and helpful to provide some significant historical context to the text. And so to that end, I ask very simply, so who was Elijah? And how did he arrive in the predicament where we find him? Of course, Elijah was a prophet. And depending on the scholar that you consult, it's commonly thought that Elijah and Elisha, his successor, although closely related stories, having both performed miracles for widows and causing their sources of oil to increase, all of which you can read in 1st and 2nd Kings, the stories of Elijah have a greater theological presence. In fact, the name itself means Yahweh is my God. Elijah's ministry is one in which he engages in public declarations against the worship of Baal. In fact, Elijah presents, quite frankly, as a champion of social justice, whereas his successor presents a bit more like a wonder worker. So we encounter Elijah in the text literally running for his life. After having called down fire from heaven in his challenge with the prophets of Baal. See, Elijah had proved that the power of God was greater than the power of Baal. And as a result, he then ordered that all of the prophets or all of the followers of Baal be taken. He said, let not one of them escape. And Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon, and there he killed them. Again, you can read the whole story in 1st Kings. But having killed all the prophets, Ahab then decides that he's going to report this to Jezebel. Jezebel had a message of her own to send. She told a messenger to tell Elijah, so let the gods do to me and more also, if I don't make your life as one of theirs by this time tomorrow. There was a sense of immediacy as to why Elijah was running. He, in verse 3, receives this message and he jumps up and he runs to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. And the message was ringing in his head so profoundly that he leaves his servant there. As I was reading this, what I like to think is a free, interesting point of interest, sometimes we have to recognize when someone or something who used to be helpful to us becomes a hindrance. I know, that kind of stings. But not only must we recognize when someone or something that once served us well has become a hindrance, we must also be willing to leave that person or that thing there while we go further. Sometimes that something is a habit that served us well in the past, or that something may be a way of thinking that served us well in the past. Sometimes that something, like with Elijah, is actually someone. That's why I don't get broken up when people leave congregations. Perhaps they have gone with us as far as they were designed to go. May the Lord bless them. May the Lord keep them. May God turn God's face towards them. May God be gracious unto them in their new endeavors and grant them peace. When I worked in HR, that was a common, I guess, soapbox topic for me. Not all turnover is bad turnover. United Christian Church, know this with all certainty. Not everyone who has journeyed with us up to this point will always journey with us, and that's okay. Why? Because as with Elijah, our God still provides. So Elijah goes on another day. He makes it to a wilderness place. and he makes his way under a juniper tree. And under this juniper tree, the prophet begins to talk to God. He's tired, he's weary, he had worked hard, he had sent to the widow of Zarephath and even sustained or provided for her. He had raised the widow's son from the dead. He met the governor Obadiah. He called down fire from heaven. He prayed for and received rain, and now he was on the run for his life. And yes, the Lord still had life-saving and life-giving work for him to do. Tired wasn't an option. Can you imagine being so consumed with life that the best one could imagine is death? Not only does Elijah pray to die, but in his request, he states why. I'm no better off than my ancestors. There's an apparent state of despair and weariness. Can you hear the tired single mother working for less than livable wages, sitting at the bus stop? Lord, let me die. I'm no better off than Rosa. Can you hear the faith leader cry? Lord, let me die. I'm no better off than Martin. Or the mother of Mike Brown, Lord, this year alone in the US, there have already been to date 150 Black women, men, and children killed at the hands of police. Please just let me die. I'm no better off than we were 10 years ago. Elijah declared, I'm no better off than my ancestors, and he drifts off to sleep. God rejects Elijah's request to die. Instead, God provides divine nourishment. Although Elijah, a faithful prophet, a servant, a minister, although he became tired, despondent, and some would say, and I agree, even depressed, even with all of that, there was still work that the Lord had for just him to do. I hear that as good news. No matter what I've gone through, no matter how the situation looks to me in these my mortal eyes, no matter what I'm facing right now, no matter how long I've been unemployed, no matter how my retirement has dwindled, no matter how many memorials I attend, no matter how many weary sons and daughters reach out in distress, no matter if I am literally running for my life, God still sees me. God still hears my desperate cry. And the good news is God answers in the here and now, not just in the sweet by and by. God is still choosing us and using us, United Christian Church, for the building and equipping of God's kingdom. To welcome the stranger, to comfort the sick and the suffering, to feed the hungry, to embrace the ostracized. Why is God still calling us to do this? Why is God still using us as the hands and feet of Christ? Because refugees are still seeking asylum. Children are still impoverished. My LGBTQIA+ sisters and brothers are still being shunned in the name of God. Religion is being weaponized against God's people. And because in as much as we've done it to the least of these, we've done it also to him. Tired isn't an option. And the Lord knew and the Lord knows what the next assignment will be. The Lord knew that this servant could not make the journey in his own strength. In verse 7, the angel of the Lord came the second time and touched him. And remember, he says, get up and go. Otherwise, you won't be able to make it. I believe the same message is true for us today. We're constantly and incessantly feasting on the nibbles and sound bites that media is serving up. And at the rate in which we consume political information, highlights and updates of wars and rumors and wars and ticker tape news is pouring into our already tired minds, bodies, and spirits, so much so that our souls become tired. I believe the message, I believe the task, I believe the challenge from today's text is for us to acknowledge that even in our faithfulness, we sometimes get tired, and to acknowledge that in order for us to run on a little further, that we need only that which the Lord can give us. Lord, feed us this morning, that we too may have the strength to do whatever it is you would have us to do. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. We need to feast on divine spiritual nourishment. Let us feast on prayer. Let us feast on scripture. Let us feast on meditation. Blessed is the one whose delight is in the word of the Lord. That person is like the tree planted by the streams of water. Let us feast on psalms and spiritual songs. Paul encouraged the church at Ephesus that speak to one another in psalms and hymns and songs of the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. Whether it was on the slave plantation, whether it was the Edmund Pettus Bridge, whether it was Ebenezer Baptist Church, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, in the blood-soaked streets of Tulsa, on the Montgomery riverfront, or in the tear gas streets of Ferguson, wherever social justice prophets of God gather, we have been and we are strengthened and empowered through the ministry of song. The church saying, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I'm walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Some of you may remember, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking. I'm gonna keep on talking. I'm gonna keep on marching to freedom land. Some of you heard Mahalia Jackson sing, How I Got Over. How I got over. My soul looks back in wonder. How I got over. My mom played for us the Fifth Jubilee Singers who sang, I'm gonna sing till the Spirit moves. I'm gonna sing until the Spirit comes. I'm gonna sing until my Jesus comes. Freedom fighters like Mariamo Njumbe, the mother of my former pastor, the Reverend Lukata Njumbe, saying, oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my God and be free. I believe we, like James Cleveland and like the Mighty Clouds of Joy, that we too have a song. I don't feel no waste tide. I've come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me that the road would be easy. I don't believe God brought me this far to leave me. I just can't give up now. I've come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me that the road would be easy. I don't believe God brought me this far. I don't believe God brought us this far. I don't believe God brought me this far to leave me. United Christian Church, tired simply isn't an option. This is the message from God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.